So, I know this isn't an incredibly unique thing to say, but I love Spider-Man. And when Spider-Man PS4 came out, I played it like non-stop, and it was easily my favorite game of 2018. Granted, I didn't play that many video games, but it was still really good. But anyway, you're all here for the Miles Morales game, but one more quick thing. If you're new here, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. I'm a really small channel and it'd help me out so much. Alright, let's just get into it now. Spider-Man Miles Morales stars, well, Miles Morales in the leading role this time around, and I probably would have been more skeptical about it had Spider-Verse not blown my mind with Miles. But in this game, Miles has barely any experience with being Spider-Man, and it can be assumed he was only trained by Peter, who, wow, he looks a little different. Probably only trained him for a few weeks or months. And this leads to a lot of interesting confrontations because Miles is still figuring out he has powers, or new powers, and he's just got to do all this stuff on his own while Peter's away. Now, this game isn't perfect by any means. I do have some issues with it, but I'll address that later. But I'm going to divide the video into two separate parts to make it neat. One for gameplay and one for story. Now, if you haven't played or watched the game, I recommend you do that first, but I'm not going to go into anything major spoiler heavy here if you still want to watch anyway. Alright, now for the gameplay. I'm ready. The main concern I had going into this game was that it would be exactly the same as the first Spider-Man game, but with Miles. Luckily, this isn't really the case. There's a lot Insomniac does to make this feel like its own thing, making Miles unique from Peter. We get different abilities like the Venom Strike, which is really fun, and the ability to go invisible, which makes stealth a lot more interesting and adds a lot of variety to combat. The swinging from Miles is also really improved and fluid, and that's accompanied with the fact that you can do a lot of tricks in the air. There were moments where I would just do nothing but swing around New York. It's just so much fun. I also like that they replaced the tedious radio puzzles with Miles and his friend Genki developing an app that alerts you of crime. This was really unique in my opinion, and it really modernizes Miles. Now, to get into some negatives about the gameplay, it does kind of, at times, feel a little repetitive. Stopping car chases or people breaking into buildings can get kind of boring doing over and over for activity tokens. And there's only a handful of side missions that I actually really enjoy doing. There's still a lot of dumb stuff like chasing pigeons, fixing pipes, and it's not all that fun apart from a couple where you're actually having cutscenes and you're really engaging with people in Harlem. Next, I know this game is really meant for next-gen consoles, so due to that I think this caused some frame rate issues, at least for me personally. I just have a regular PS4, so that doesn't really help either, but there are a lot of instances where my FPS would drop, especially when using the Venom Strike, but even just swinging around and fighting people regularly, I would get some frame drops, and it was a little bit distracting at times. Lastly, this does feel a little more like an expansion pack, so there's not a ton of variety in combat scenarios, side missions, and a lot of other stuff. I'd say it barely meets the $50 threshold, but just barely. I had a lot of fun with the gameplay, and I think if you truly want to get your money's worth, you should really take your time. There are a lot of times in the game where I would just linger around looking at all the details. For example, in Miles' apartment, there's a lot of interactable stuff there, and you can keep interacting with characters even after they're done talking, and it makes the game feel more realistic and lively. One of the main things I love about this game is that even when you finish the story, there's still quite a bit to do afterwards. And if you stopped just right after the story, you'd be missing out on a lot of good epilogue and one really touching side mission that also kind of wraps up a lot of character arcs meanwhile. There's just a lot of hidden detail in the game, and speeding through it really wouldn't do it justice. Overall, the gameplay is pretty great, but can get a little tedious and repetitive at points. Alright, now for the story. The story in Spider-Man PS4 is probably some of the best Spider-Man stuff ever. I think Miles is a great character here in this game, but his story is just slightly above average in my opinion. To start off, the villain is basically as cliche as you can get here. He's an evil, quirky businessman with ulterior motives. Luckily, he's not the main villain though. I think the Tinkerer is a great villain for Miles. She's got her own backstory that's very personal and very tied into Miles. My complaint about the Tinkerer is her origin. I just thought that was not done too creatively. I think watching her origin through the science experiment gone wrong has been done so much in just storytelling in general that it wasn't all that engaging. I know I'm being a little negative here, but this is still a great Spider-Man story. It's got all the heart oozed into the story, the side characters like his mom, Genki, J. Jonah Jameson, the lady on the podcast, Uncle Aaron, and Finn all work very well in this game. I think the pace of the story is actually really good here, and this is one of those scenarios where a shorter game really helps. There's not a lot of time to waste since the story is like half of Spider-Man PS4, so the story gets moving pretty quickly here. And by the end of the game, I was actually really invested, the visuals are great, and it's really intense, albeit a little bit predictable in how it unfolds. I wouldn't say it left me bawling like at the end of Spider-Man PS4 did, but this game really did leave on a really emotional note. Despite its flaws, Spider-Man Miles Morales is a great, inspiring Spider-Man story that really understands the character. With countless iterations and several more coming out, this game still manages to be original, exciting, fun, and most importantly tells you that anyone can be Spider-Man. In conclusion, this game is very good. I don't think everyone would love this, and some may feel disappointed because of its length. But if you just like Spider-Man as a character and you loved the previous game, I highly recommend this. And like I said before, don't rush through the game. You can tell there was just so much time and effort into making this, and only playing this just to get through the cutscenes simply wouldn't do it justice. I'm gonna give Spider-Man Miles Morales a 7.5 out of 10. I think it's definitely a solid game, and I'm really looking forward to what Insomniac does with Spider-Man next. So what did you guys think of Spider-Man Miles Morales? Did you love it? Did you hate it? I'd love to know your opinions down in the comments below, and with all that being said, please leave a like and even subscribe. Peace.